Thanks very much, and thank you to you and Piotr and the other organizers for the invitation. It's very nice to be here. It's been a very enjoyable conference so far. What I'm going to talk about today is actually based on a chapter in this Oxford Handbook of Wellbeing and Public Policy. It's joint work with Vito Peragine, and it's kind of a survey of this literature on equality of opportunity with a little bit of theory and a little bit of evidence. It's organized around, somebody said yesterday that every good presentation has 3 parts, so you can tell already this is a bad presentation because it has 6 parts. I'll start by motivating a little bit why, after a serious conference on a serious topic on labor market issues, I'm going to talk about equality of opportunity. So that needs some motivation, and I'll tell you a little bit about that. Then I'll present some models of equality of opportunity, talk a little bit about measurement, empirical applications, extensions, and conclusions. So my motivation starts with 2 sort of quotes from famous Americans, some more famous than others. But I'll start with a quote by FDR, former president of the US, who said in his second inaugural address, "We know that equality of ability has never existed and never will, but we do insist that equality of opportunity still must be sought." And 75 years later, Alan Kruger, who is a well-known labor economist that needs no introduction here, whilst he was chairman of Obama's Council of Economic Advisors, described the rise in inequality in the United States recently by saying that over the last 3 decades, that rise has reached the point that inequality in incomes is causing an unhealthy division of opportunities and is a threat to our economic growth. So the point I'm making is that both policymakers and economists talk about the distribution of opportunities, sometimes loosely, but it's a language that's used. And so the question is, if these concepts of equality and inequality of opportunity matter for policy, can we actually say anything about it rigorously? Can we define it and measure it rigorously? So that's the motivation, I think, for much of this literature which we survey in this piece. And it's impossible not to start a discussion of this topic without a little bit of a reference to the philosophical background, because the literature, the first discipline, I think, that tried to formalize the concept of equality of opportunity were philosophers. And the philosophers that did this did it in the context of a literature in the 1970s and 80s that was kind of changing the space in which the definitions of social justice were made. So the first reference that's typically made is to John Rawls, A Theory of Justice, but there's Amartya Sen's work on equality of, there's his famous tenor lectures called Equality of What? These are all people thinking, to assess what constitutes social justice and what makes a good society a good society. Is it enough to look at the distribution of incomes or at some concept like utility, which had been the sort of default social welfare theory for economists since Jeremy Bentham in the 1700s? In that context, there was a lot of different theories and different things going on, but one of them, which drew in particular on Ronald Dworkin and Richard Arnson and Jerry Cohen, was the idea that in order to assess fairness, you needed more information than just the distribution of incomes, and in particular, that there were possibly 2 kinds of income differences. Those caused by differences in individual choices, in efforts, or things that can be explained by individual responsibility. And those, they feel, those may be more justifiable. But then there's another kind of inequality, which is inequality that's really due to circumstances over which individuals have no control. Race, gender, family background. And those inequalities are much less acceptable. Right? So there's a lot of part of the literature here, Dworkin, Arnson, Cohen, where people are thinking about inequality of opportunity as the inequality that arises from factors over which individuals have no control. Okay? So Jerry Cohen, one of the philosophers in this literature, said, this approach of looking at the distribution of opportunities performs for egalitarianism the considerable service of incorporating within it the most powerful idea in the arsenal of the anti-egalitarian right, the idea of choice and responsibility. Okay? So philosophers had started this in the 70s and 80s, and in the 1990s, economists started to think about, okay, can we formalize these concepts in economic terms, in terms of an economic model? In the survey, we distinguish between a number of different approaches. There's a direct approach, there's an indirect approach, and then within the indirect approach, there are variations, the ex ante and ex post. I am going to focus in this talk only on the indirect approach, and in particular on the ex ante version of the indirect approach. But let me say just a few words about what the direct approach was. The direct approach was people like Patanaik and Shu and Kranich and Barbera and others who were basically thinking of opportunities as sets in a very abstract sense, and they were interested in the distribution of opportunity sets. It was kind of related to the capability approach of Sen and thinking of capabilities as a set of functionings. You know, this is something that you may be familiar with. There was also a literature in inequality of opportunity that tried to think of the people's distributions of opportunity sets, try to value those sets, and then establish various relations across them. My interest in this literature has to do with stuff that eventually became operationalizable and empirically tractable. And as far as I know, those direct approaches to inequality of opportunity never actually generated empirical applications because, for no other reason, just because it's very hard to think of a set of opportunities, to observe a set of opportunities, because opportunities are counterfactual things, right, from which you then select one. And when you select something, that becomes a factual, but the rest, your other choices, the choices not taken, are somehow counterfactual, so that's hard. The indirect approach, therefore, avoids this idea of trying to model sets and tries to make inferences about the distribution of opportunities on the basis of joint distributions of circumstances and outcomes. So the key thing to remember here is that the informational basis for the judgment of a society expands from looking just at a vector of incomes or outcomes and into looking now at the determinants of those incomes and outcomes into two groups. Those over which you have no control, as I say, so things like circumstances, and those over which you have some control, which are efforts. Okay? And this, as I say here, builds primarily on this Richard Arnson and Jerry Cohen view of equality of opportunity as to do with what things you can control and what things you cannot. And this approach has two fundamental principles. Okay? And these two principles determine or refer to these different kinds of inequality. So they say, the language here is from Marc Fleurbe in the 90s, and he says, okay, outcome differences due to factors beyond an individual's responsibility, which are sometimes called circumstances, are unfair and should be compensated. So the principle of compensation is the locus of introduction of egalitarianism here. It's saying those kinds of inequalities that are due to things you cannot control, like your parents' wealth, or your parents' background, or whether you were born in Warsaw or in a small town in a rural area. All of those things, those are the unfair inequalities, right? But then there is also a principle of reward, which says there are some kinds of differences, those which are due to the individual responsibility or efforts, which are ethically legitimate and should be preserved. So this is the locus of introduction of individual responsibility in here. This is the bit of this theory that says not all inequalities are unfair. Some may be okay. Right? All right. So in the early 90s, people like Marc Fleurbe, John Romer, Dirk van der Geer, Walter Bossert, all kind of wrote fairly theoretical treatments of this stuff, and some of it is very complex. I'm going to simplify it. What Vito and I do in this paper is we simplify it to the bare bones and present a very schematic kind of canonical model, just with whatever's common to those other guys. Those other guys have very different approaches. This is kind of the canonical basic model that you need to do two things, which I'll talk about in a moment. And so the essence of it, in our understanding, the essence of the economic modeling of equality of opportunity is around defining an individual by three things, by a triple. One outcome variable X, which you often called an advantage. Mostly here, I'm just going to call it income, but it could be educational attainment, or it could be health status, anything that people have reason to value intrinsically and over which there's no satiation. So more of it is always a good thing, or at least not a bad thing. Then everything else, the determinants of X, can be grouped into two kinds of things. Either you control them to some extent, or you don't control them at all. If you control them to some extent, they're represented by this effort index, E, which I'm going to treat as a scalar. And if you don't control them, then they are a vector of circumstances. Again, things like your gender, your race, your family background, your place of birth, whatever. Whether your mother sent you to a crash, whether you were well taken care of, all of those things that determine who you are, but over which you have no control, those are the circumstances C, right? And C and E fully determine X. So, you then may ask things like, what about luck? And there's a whole philosophical literature about the treatment of luck in this regard. Some people try to treat luck as a separate third factor, but most of the people in this literature say, well, even luck has to be divided up. There's some luck which is kind of brute luck. You have no choice over it either. You're walking down the street and a piano falls on your head. That's very bad luck, and you had no control over it. That's C. But then there's luck over which you have some choice. It's option luck. You sort of went to the casino and you gambled away your house and you lost it. Well, that's E. Okay? You see? And so philosophers have written books about this. I won't dwell on it here because I don't. But the fundamental thing in this is that you got to buy into this approach, you've got to be able to classify everything that determines your outcome into either circumstances or efforts. Now, before you just give up in disbelief and walk away, let me say that it's not totally silly. I mean, we do, of course, know that E will be affected by C. Okay? So it is, of course, an understanding that there are things you can control, like your own level of education, which do depend on things you cannot control, like your parents' education, for example. So that's allowed for, and one could have a structural model of this, and some people have tried that. It's not the route I'm going to go today, but that, of course, is allowed. What's not allowed is that E affects C. C is fully exogenous from the point of view of the individual, right? So C are circumstances that you cannot control, therefore they cannot be affected by E. Okay? So there's a mapping from C and E to X. And in order to see that very clearly, let me just make a few very simplifying assumptions. Let all elements of C as well as E be discrete. That means that we can denote X by X sub ij. I like to tell the story because it's true. That I and J there, which should be subscripts, I've made them into subscripts about 18 times by now, and they always go back to not being subscripts. So I don't know what's going on. But anyway, Xij is a function of Ci and Cj. Now, then we have a population, right, of people that have Xijs. Let's define a type as those individuals with identical circumstances. So you should think of C as, for example, if we have two elements of C, race and gender, then there would be four types, right? Black men, white men, black women, white women. And if you have family background, and if you add other things, places, but then you start kind of having a factorial or a power of these things, and you have more and more types. So a type will be individuals with identical circumstances. A trench will be individuals with identical effort levels, EJ. Okay? So let me, without loss of generality, say that there will be N types and M trenches. That, of course, allows me to define the population or to represent the population by an m by m matrix xij. And I can associate to that matrix xij another matrix of densities, of frequencies, which gives me the proportion of the total population in each cell. All right? So here's my matrix. So that's now the population. The population, there's a matrix P that gives me the density in each of these cells. And each of these rows there is a type. All right? So this would be Polish women whose parents are Ukrainian, born in small towns, or something like that. That's a type. And a trench is people who exert the same degree of effort. Okay? Now, effort you may ask about, how is effort measured in here? And there are some people who've tried to measure effort explicitly, but it's incredibly complicated. So the trick that we usually use is an assumption by John Romer of Yale in his book that says, look, I'm just going to observe types. And within a type, the only thing that varies within a type is effort, by definition, right? Including the effort parts of luck, as it were. So if that's true, then I can just use as an indicator of effort the percentile of your distribution within a type. And that has the advantage that you're comparing percentiles. So if a particular type spends more absolute effort. For example, I used to teach a little bit in Paris, and I would say, you know, if the kids of the parents who went to the ENA and Polytechnique and so on, if those kids whose parents were like that study extremely hard, and the kids of the parents in the banlieue outside of Paris don't study as hard, right? That average difference is actually a circumstance. It's a consequence. It's a representation of the way in which the circumstances are affecting efforts. So what you want to compare as effort is the relative ranking of effort rather than the absolute ranking of effort. That's called the Romer identification assumption, and you can quibble with it or not, but it's the way that's often used in the data. Okay. So, yeah, sure.
Then I understand that you have to assume that these types are really homogeneous inside a particular type. And is that assumption really always a good match? How many types you have to create to make sure that they are like all the women, Polish women born to Ukrainian parents in small town, that type should be really homogeneous.
Yes, no, you're absolutely right. So the reason in a moment I'll come to the fact that all our measures are lower bound measures of inequality of opportunity is the fact that we never observe the full set of circumstances. Okay, and I'll come back to that in a moment. So that's a very good point. Now, I'm going to use this graph for a few things, so let me introduce it briefly. So I had treated everything here as discrete, right? Now, if efforts were continuous, we could represent the society as something like this instead of a matrix. And what this is let's think of this as a quantile function. So these are quantile functions. Quantile functions are the inverse of distribution functions, right? So here I've got people ranked from 0 to 1 by percentile of the distribution, and there I've got their income. If I flip this would be a distribution function. But instead of having one distribution function for the whole society, I have one for each type. So each of these colors here corresponds to a type, all right? And this is their effort levels on this axis and their income levels on that effort. That's their quantile functions, okay? So that's another representation, which I'll come back to in a moment. Okay. This is the basic model, the sort of the workhorse of this stuff. Now I want to introduce one little theoretical subtlety, which is the difference that I refer to up here between the ex-ante and the ex-post approach. And then I'll later end up spending most of my time talking about ex-ante applications. But this is a distinction that you do encounter quite a lot in the literature, so let me mention it here. The difference between the ex-ante and the ex-post approach is driven by the fact that people in the literature took different views of the principle of compensation. The principle of compensation, if you remember, is the one that says outcome differences due to things you cannot control should be compensated. Now, the ex-ante approach, which is due to Van der Geyer primarily, says let's eliminate inequalities. Compensation should be eliminating inequalities between types, So before effort is realized, before I see anything to do with effort, I value the opportunity set of a type and I try to make the types equal. John Romer says, well, no, I mean, I do observe effort, and what I mean by the principle of compensation is that people who spend the same degree of effort should get the same reward. That's what compensation should be like. If you two spend the same degree of effort, you should get the same result, okay? Now, the difference between the two is that under this Romer one, you have to have degrees of effort. In the other one, you're just equating opportunity sets in some way. The principle of reward, there are different versions of it as well, but I won't dwell on that. I'm just going to treat reward as liberal reward in the rest of the talk. So this is the last hard slide, and then after that, everything gets much easier. And in this slide, I want to say two things. First, what have people used this framework for? People have used this framework to do two things. They have used it in a normative way. So this is a bit of economics that, you know, it's not fashionable nowadays, but there is normative economics as well as positive economics. And normative economics is about saying, okay, what should policymakers aim for? How can I rank societies? And conversely, what allocation rule should I choose in terms of my policies in order to maximize something? So this is a normative question of what is a fair society, what is a just society, what should I do to promote justice in that society? That's one thing. The other use of this model is more positive rather than normative, and that's just to measure the degree of inequality of opportunity in a society. Okay, and I'll take you through examples of both of those things. Before doing that, let me give you some of the key theoretical results, which Marc Flerbet and my co-author Vito Peragine have in a paper in 2013, and I'll explain them in a moment. But three basic results. This difference between ex ante and ex post compensation is non-trivial. The two approaches are actually inconsistent, in the sense that you may have a situation in which to promote ex ante compensation would go the other way from ex post compensation. So that means you have to choose one of the two. Right? The ex post compensation principle also is inconsistent with reward principles, but the ex ante compensation principle is not inconsistent with reward principles. Now, before you just say this doesn't make any sense to me, let me explain some of this using this little graph that I mentioned before. So first of all, as I said here, this framework was originally used to promote allocation rules or orderings. The first of these is Dirk van der Gaar's approach of the min of means. So Dirk says, what should society do? Society or the policymaker should seek to promote the well-being of the poorest type. So people with whatever circumstances they have, let's say black women born in inner cities in the United States, okay? So those guys, if those guys have the lowest mean, for example, the lowest valuation for their opportunity set, the objective of policy should be to increase their mean. And once their mean becomes the same as the next type, you promote those two means. And so it goes lexicographically. So there's a Rawlsian element to this. The idea is to promote, to increase the opportunity sets, the distribution of well-being for the poorest type. Okay? So the maximand of the social problem of the planner would be to maximize the minimum of the set of types, valued somehow, and I'm using the mean here to value it, but it could be a different thing. An alternative allocation rule, which corresponds to the ex post compensation. So this corresponds to the ex ante compensation, right? In that it doesn't require you to observe any effort levels. It's all the means that you're doing. Now, Romer, if you remember, as I described before, said, if you exert the same degree of effort, you should get the same reward. So Romer's program is to look at each level of effort and to promote, to maximize the minimum, right, the minimum level at that level of effort. The objective to sort of equate these lines, if you like, to make all of those lines equal. And this explains to you why reward and ex post compensation are inconsistent. Reward is about saying the difference along this green line or along this red line is fair. The only thing that varies along the red line is effort. Those people have the same circumstances. So I should respect those differences. But if these lines cross, or unless they're completely parallel, right, then if I equate the line, I must be changing the slope of some of those lines. You see that? And that's why ex post compensation and reward are inconsistent. Ex ante compensation and reward are consistent because I can make all those means the same without changing the slope of the line, if you see that. Okay. That was a very brief incursion into the normative world of equality of opportunity, this idea of using this to sort of guide thinking about policy in terms of these things. I should say, just before I go on that from a normative perspective, what happened was that the informational basis, right, which is required to assess social justice, has expanded a little bit. Most of us typically think of inequality or of poverty or of well-being as a function of a vector of axis. And you don't need any information on C. All you need is the incomes. These guys are telling you, well, if you feel that some differences in income are justified, you need more information than just the X. You need information on X and circumstances, at least, in order to then be able to say something about justice. Okay? Now, moving from a normative perspective to a more positive one, but still one that says opportunities matter and I care about measuring inequality in opportunities, well then, in essence, the measurement, there are a number of different approaches, but the essence of it is to take that matrix X that we saw here, right? To take that matrix, and to eliminate from it, so I say here, the measurement of inequality of opportunity is a two-step procedure. First, you take the actual matrix Xij, and then you transform it into a counterfactual distribution X tilde by eliminating all the fair inequality. So you leave only the unfair inequality, okay? And then once all the fair inequality is removed, in the second step, you apply an inequality index to that matrix. That's all there is to it. So the name of the game is to somehow eliminate the fair inequality from X and then measure it that way. Now, as I've already told you, there are these different approaches, and so I'm going to go very quickly through 4 counterfactual matrices that people have proposed as a way of doing this. The first of them is really simple. It draws directly on the Van der Gaar min of means approach, remember, on this thing here, right? And it says, okay, I'm going to remove the fair inequality by taking all the variation within a type away. Remember, that was the fair inequality, the inequality in effort within a type. So I'm going to replace your Xij with just your mean. I'm going to give you the value of your opportunity set. So all you've got now is inequality between types, between those means. The inequality within types has been eliminated. Okay? That's clearly satisfying this ex ante compensation approach. And because it eliminates all the inequality within a type, it satisfies reward as well. All of that inequality is fair and all of it is gone. But the ex post guys don't like this very much. So they want to measure unfair inequality as the inequality within trenches. Right? Remember, Romer is telling you, what I don't like is the fact that these 3 people here have got different incomes because they exert the same effort. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep the inequality within trenches. I'm just going to multiply each trench here by, I'm going to divide each income on a trench by the mean of the trench. That's a constant, so I keep all of these things here. And I've eliminated some of the inequality between types, but probably not fully because I'm dividing by mu1, nu1, nu2, and nu3, which are different numbers. So this will satisfy ex post compensation everywhere, but it won't fully satisfy reward. Okay? Yet a different approach, and there's quite a bit of theoretical literature that has tried to that has departed from the fact that ex post compensation and reward are inconsistent and have said, okay, look, let me try to satisfy one of them somewhere and the other one fully. So one of them is this direct unfairness approach, which says, I'm going to take a reference level of effort I'm going to take a reference level of effort, say tranche 1, and I'm going to give you what you would have gotten with your circumstances if you had exerted that level of effort. So basically, instead of, just like in this other one here, where I've replaced everybody's income by their mean of the type, here I'm also replacing it by a constant, but instead of being the mean, it's the first element of that type, right? So I've eliminated all the inequality within the type once again, and so I'm going to satisfy reward everywhere, but I'm only going to satisfy ex post compensation at that tranche, because everywhere else I'm imposing the difference from the first tranche. And conversely, you could do something like that the other way, which is this fairness gap here. Here, instead of dividing by the mean of the tranche, I divide by a reference type, say x1. So I'm going to divide by x1, x1, x12, x12, x13, x13, and so that is going to satisfy reward here and ex post compensation everywhere. So, so now let me move from this little bit of theory. So what I've done so far, right, is I've told you about the basic model, and I have given you kind of different approaches to the measurement of inequality of opportunity that people have proposed, and I've shown that in this simple model of the axis of this matrix of people's, what is the matrix again? Is the distribution of income, but taking into account the differences in people's circumstances, the difference in types. Has this been used empirically? So we looked at the literature, and we could find, as I said at the beginning, no application of the direct approach, that early literature to try to measure things directly by looking at opportunity sets. The 4 approaches to measurement that I've just gone over very quickly, there are applications of all of them in the literature. In places like the Journal of Public Economics and lots of other places, there are articles that use all of those 4 indirect approaches that I've described. Now, in the rest of this talk, though, I'm going to focus only on one of them, which is the between types approach, the one that I described first over here, okay, this one. And the reason I'm going to do that is that only that one has been applied sufficiently widely so as to permit international comparison. So I'm now going to look at 8 papers that have done this for 51 countries, and I'm sure there are others, but I'll look at those, and I will just show you some results and some empirical applications on that basis. Now, as I do this, let me now come back to Piotr's original question, and that is to say that when I go to this matrix, where I've divided the population into types, then within each type I've given every person just the mean of that type, and I apply a measure of inequality, say the mean log deviation or the Gini coefficient or whatever, to that, I should be getting, in theory, a precise measure of inequality of opportunity. However, in practice, we have the problem that Piotr noted, which is that we never fully observe all the circumstances that we'd like to. And therefore, what this measure will be is it will be a lower bound measure, okay? It's going to underestimate the extent of inequality of opportunity. Now, there is a formal proof that that's a lower bound, but if you want an intuition that that's a lower bound, just think of the following. Effort I don't observe anyway. Effort is a residual, right? Effort here is just given by the percentiles of your distribution within a type, right? So what would it mean to observe more circumstances? What would it mean to, if in one data set I don't observe whether, mothers drank during pregnancy, your mother drank during pregnancy, that's a circumstance, you can't control that. Your mother drank during her pregnancy. So what would it mean to observe that or not? It would mean to partition each of these cells one more time, right? You see that? So to observe a new circumstance just means to subdivide the types further. And the between type inequality can only go up if that happens. Okay? That's the intuition for why these measures are lower bounds. If you observe more circumstances, the inequality that we're calling effort is contaminated by some inequality due to unobserved circumstances. If I observed all the circumstances, that inequality could only be higher. Okay? So having said that, then this is an illegible table that has the 8 papers. Okay, so there are these 8 papers that look at these 51 countries, okay, using various different data sets here. There's the U-Silk we've heard already about. There's India here that we talked about earlier. There's South Africa, the country we talked about earlier. People have used these different methods. The purpose of putting this table here is to show you that in many cases what the X was different across studies. In some cases, X was individual equivalent incomes. In other cases, it was per capita consumption. In other cases, it was monthly earnings, right? And the circumstances, although there's quite a lot of overlap, typically they have parental education, they have race, they have gender, and so on and so forth, but there's also some differences across them, meaning that the number of types was quite different. All this to say that if you had any sense, you would not compare these different studies, right? And of course I say that just before comparing them. So here is, coming from those 8 studies, measures of inequality of opportunity for these 51 countries, okay? This is the total bar, the red plus the blue, is mean log deviation in each of these 51 countries. And the blue, I don't know if you can see it, I hope. It's very hard to see, isn't it? The blue there, the blue, which is there, is that lower bound share of inequality of opportunity. It's important to notice it's a lower bound because it's actually often quite low. Nevertheless, there's substantial variation here. Look at Brazil, which is where I come from, which is has the highest level of inequality of opportunity here. That number, which is about 0.22, is actually higher than total inequality in income in Slovakia, for example. Meaning to say that the inequality computed just between means of types in Brazil, that inequality just between means of types, after the supposedly fair inequality was all eliminated, that is higher than the inequality in this matrix for Slovakia. Okay? So it contains some information. And we can look, for example, here I'm telling you that one of the ways we do this is just by looking at inequality in that matrix. Another one is by looking at the inequality in that matrix, inequality in the counterfactual matrix, as a share of the total observed inequality, which becomes basically like a tile decomposition. Just a tile decomposition reinterpreted as a measure of inequality of opportunity, but that's basically what it is. And in those terms, the ratios here go from 3% in Norway. Norway is somewhere there. I can't see it, but it's got to be up there somewhere. Yeah. It's disappeared on me in Norway, but there. Well, that can't be right then. It's 3% somewhere else, I'm sure. Anyway, it doesn't matter. It's 3% in some. Oh yeah, no, it's because that's right. It's because this is a bigger. Yeah, so 3% in Norway, that's right, to 40% in Malawi. So in Malawi, although Brazil has the highest level of inequality of opportunity, Malawi has the highest share of inequality of opportunity. How do these things correlate with other things? For example, people like to plot the Kuznets curve and plot inequality in income against GDP per capita. How does our measure of inequality of opportunity vary with GDP? Well, in this fashion over here, this is the log of GNI per capita. And what we see is that there tends to be a decline. It's a statistically significant decline in inequality of opportunity with development. There's huge variation at every level of GDP per capita, but there's some sort of negative association. Of course, this is purely descriptive, right? I'm not suggesting that there's any causation going anywhere here. These are very high-order aggregate things. I'm just showing you some correlations. To suggest that development is typically associated with a reduction in inequality of opportunity. Another interesting correlation I like to show is the correlation between inequality of outcomes and inequality of opportunities. And before I do that, I'm showing you a precursor to that, which is the Great Gatsby curve of Miles Korak. I don't know if people have heard of that. It's quite famous in the US debate at the moment. Miles Korak was a Canadian economist based in Ottawa, first plotted this. And in his graph, what he has is the Gini coefficient in various countries and a measure of intergenerational mobility, the intergenerational elasticity. This is really a measure of immobility. It's an inverse measure of mobility, right? You know what this is, right? This is the regression of the log of son's or daughter's income on father's income or mother's income. And the point is that these things are positively correlated, meaning that more unequal countries also have lower degrees of intergenerational mobility, which may strike you as obvious, but it was quite an influential thing in the US debate. I mean, the Alan Kruger quote that I put up first actually referred to this CORAC study. We have 5 minutes, yeah. And the point was, if you read Milton Friedman, right? Friedman's take on U.S. inequality was, well, if there's a lot of mobility, who cares about inequality? If tomorrow you're going to be rich, today you're poor, we're all just trading places, it's all good, right? But empirically, it seems to be the case that actually countries with more inequality are not more mobile, necessarily. In fact, amongst rich countries, the U.S. is relatively immobile compared to other countries. Well, intergenerational earnings elasticity is a measure of the correlation between a son's earning and his father's earning. It's related to the notion of opportunity, right? Just that inequality of opportunity cares not only about your parental background, but also about other things like race, place of birth, gender, other circumstances like that. So if you plotted the association between the two, income inequality and inequality of opportunity, you would also expect to see that upward slope, and indeed you see it there. Now you might say, look, this inequality of opportunity is a result of a decomposition. You've decomposed total inequality into these two, so of course there's some correlation. But I can take the ratio, I can take the relative measure instead, and I still have a very statistically significant correlation. Meaning to say that it's not as though inequality of opportunity and income inequality are orthogonal concepts. And by saying you should focus on inequality of opportunity somehow means you shouldn't worry about this. On the whole, the two are closely associated statistically. And that's not surprising. If you have a society where there's huge gaps between the rich and the poor, presumably the opportunities they can offer their children are equally disparate, right? So it's not surprising that you see that. Some other empirical applications are now beginning to use these measures of inequality of opportunity, that measures like these ones that we've computed here, in slightly more causal analysis. And let me give you two very brief examples before a very quick extension in my conclusions. The two examples are one. These graphs are from a paper by Marrero and Rodriguez in the Journal of Development Economics, 2013, where they go to that old literature of the relationship between inequality and growth. You may remember Alesina. Someone mentioned them yesterday. Can't remember who it was, but there was a mention of Alesina and Roderick and Tabellini and so on, all those papers in the old literature, Galore and Zera, Banerjee and Newman, all this literature about inequality and growth, and then Christine Forbes in 2000 in the AR saying, no, it goes the other way, inequality is actually good for growth, and then other people come back later and say, no, it's bad for growth, and there's all this debate, and it's all very unresolved, and a number of us felt, well, maybe it's unresolved because inequality is a bit like cholesterol. There's this good type and this bad type. Inequality of opportunity is really the bad type. So what if I separate good cholesterol from bad cholesterol in the regression? So Marrero and Rodriguez do this for 26 states in the US using the PSID, and that's the regression of growth on total inequality. That's the regression on inequality of effort, i.e. the residual, and that's the regression of inequality of opportunity. So once they take cholesterol and divide it into good and bad, they do get something that was statistically insignificant into a negative and significant effect of inequality of opportunity on growth. The interpretation being, yes, you are getting these mixed results about inequality and growth because you are conflating two different kinds of inequality. If Piotr works much harder than me and he gets rewarded, that's a good thing. It's good for growth. But if, let me pick on somebody else. If Ben and I, right, if the reason that I do less well than Ben is simply that my parents never took care of me and I grew up in some remote place and I don't get a chance, well, that's bad for growth because if you had invested in me, maybe I would have done something useful with my life, right? That's the interpretation. So I've little time, so let me skip the other one on here and just finish with an extension and then some very brief conclusions. The extension that I want to go back to here is something I did some time ago with François Bourguignon and Michael Walton. And that was in a dialogue with John Romer, trying to say, okay, what is the objective function then? I told you, going back to a normative question. So John Romer, commenting on some earlier work of ours, was saying, it's not clear. Do these guys care about efficiency? Do they care about equality of opportunity? What are they trying to maximize? And so in our minds, what we were trying to maximize was to maximize, a bit like Van der Gaar, right, the minimum, but not of just the mean of the poorest type, the present discounted value of the mean of the poorest type, okay, subject to a constraint that any income should be above some certain minimum. Okay, so this does two or three things. First of all, there's still a Rawlsian criterion in our objective function. We still care about the lowest type, but we're development economists. We can't ignore growth, right? We can't have a system that says maximize the min today, regardless of what incentives we do for the future. So we have to take into account that there's possible growth. And so we do want to have policies that promote efficiency, so it's the present discounted value over time of the lowest type that's highest, okay? This means that absolute poverty should be seen as a constraint. And this bit over here is a nod to Robert Nozick, for those of you who know him. It says, actually, the policies that you should use are those that belong to this capital Phi set here, which is a permissible policy set. That incorporates, of course, technical feasibility and budget constraints, but also social acceptability. Another example I like to give my students is, you could promote equality of opportunity a lot by forcing rich kids to marry poor kids. Assortative matching is a main way, an important way in which inequality of opportunity gets perpetuated. Yet, many societies may decide that that's a violation of individual freedom and not a permissible policy. Okay. So let me conclude. This is my last slide. Again, remember, this is a chapter that we wrote for a handbook, so you have to sort of, at the end, say something about what you think of the state of the literature at this point. And we thought this literature had achieved some things. It is beginning to change the space in which fairness judgments are made, to the extent that economists care about normative principles. People who've read this literature are beginning to think that some elements of choice matter, and are therefore being forced to focus on types as a construct that's important, okay? It has, as I say, incorporated respect for individual responsibility into this egalitarian framework. What are the limitations? We noted 3 limitations here, and with that I'll end. First, there's an issue of robustness. I spent a lot of time in this talk talking about this approach and that approach and showing you different matrices, and I could feel you falling asleep as I was doing that. And that's a problem of this literature. This literature is still sort of very much in its infancy, with people trying lots of different things. We like to say it's a little bit like inequality measurement before Lawrence curves, before Tony Atkinson in 1970 said, look, whatever the index is, if this Lawrence curve lies above the other one, inequality is less bad. Okay, so there's some sense in which we need a bit more of that in this literature. Perhaps the biggest problem of all is accuracy. So people like Ben's co-author Ravi Kambur and my colleague Adam Wagstaff have in a paper, but there are some, but there are others who've criticized this literature for saying, you're giving us these lower bounds. How informative are they? I mean, if the true number is very different from the lower bound, if the point estimate, could you observe it, should you be able to observe it, is very different, then what does the lower bound ranking matter? There's no guarantee that the lower bound, even the ranking is the same. And that is true, and there's some new work by these guys here, Andreas Speichel and this lady whose name I can't pronounce, using panel data and fixed effects to try and get at lower and upper bounds. And I think that's really interesting work. And the third thing is the issue of dimensionality. X was a scalar. Much of the other work on pushing the boundaries out of beyond utilitarianism are actually about multidimensionality of well-being. What would happen if we also had vectors of x's? Things could get a lot more complicated. So it's a literature that is in its infancy, but there's some promise to it, and there's a lot of pickup in the economics literature. It's certainly not yet the mainstream, but there's more and more interest in it. And if we manage to deal with some of these problems, I think it could become perhaps influential. So thank you very much. I'll end there.